The November rain hammered against the tin roof of the warehouse as the auctioneer's voice echoed through the cavernous space filled with industrial remnants and forgotten machinery. Walter Hammond stood near the back, his weathered hands tucked deep into the pockets of his canvas jacket, observing the proceedings with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 50 years coaxing life from dead metal. At 73 years old, he had seen enough estate sales and liquidation auctions to know that most of what surrounded him would end up in the same scrapyard where he occasionally sold materials when his small repair shop ran slow during winter months. The item that caught his attention was Lot 47, described simply as industrial engine component, origin unknown, sold as is for scrap metal. It sat on a reinforced pallet in the corner, barely visible beneath decades of accumulated rust, grime, and what appeared to be old canvas tarps that had fused to the metal over time. The engine block, if that's what it truly was, measured approximately 6 feet in length and stood nearly 4 feet tall, its bulk suggesting something far more substantial than the typical automotive engines Walter had rebuilt countless times throughout his career. The oxidation had transformed the metal into a mottled landscape of deep oranges and browns, with patches of black where moisture had penetrated most deeply into the iron and steel components. Most attendees barely glanced at the corroded mass before moving on to more promising lots that included functional machine tools, copper wiring, and other materials with obvious resale value. The auctioneer seemed equally unimpressed, mentioning the estimated scrap weight at approximately 1,200 pounds and suggesting a starting bid that reflected nothing more than the current market price for ferrous metal. Walter's instinct, however, had been honed by decades of seeing past surface damage to the engineering beneath, and something about the configuration of cooling fins barely visible through the rust, the unusual mounting points, and the sheer complexity suggested by the corroded components protruding at various angles made him pause his circuit through the warehouse. If you're finding this story as intriguing as Walter found that mysterious engine, smash that subscribe button and hit the super thanks to support more incredible historical discoveries like this one. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the world as we uncover these amazing forgotten treasures together. He moved closer, circling the pallet while other bidders focused on a collection of vintage hand tools being offered 3 lots ahead. The engine sat at an angle, supported by wooden blocks that had compressed under the weight over what must have been years, perhaps decades, of storage in conditions that had not been kind to metal components. Remnants of what might have once been protective coverings hung in tatters from various protrusions, the fabric so degraded that it crumbled at the slightest touch. Walter crouched down, his knees protesting the movement, and used a small penlight from his pocket to peer into the shadows beneath the bulk of the engine block. What he saw made his pulse quicken in a way it hadn't in years. The casting marks, though obscured by corrosion, showed a level of precision and complexity that spoke to high-performance engineering rather than industrial or agricultural applications. The cylinder arrangement, while difficult to confirm without proper examination, appeared to be a radial configuration, the type used almost exclusively in aircraft engines rather than ground-based machinery. The mounting points, though corroded, seemed designed for airframe installation rather than the fixed mounting systems used in stationary applications or vehicles. Several components that might have been supercharger housings or reduction gear assemblies protruded from what he assumed was the front section of the engine, their purposes mysterious but their complexity undeniable. The auction proceeded through several more lots while Walter remained near the corroded engine, his mind working through possibilities and calculations. The scrap value barely exceeded $300 at current prices, accounting for the fuel he would need to transport such a heavy object and the time required to process it. But if his suspicion was correct, if this truly was an aircraft engine from a significant period in aviation history, the value could range from several $1,000s for a common trainer aircraft engine to potentially hundreds of thousands for a rare military variant, depending on type, manufacturer, and historical significance. The risk seemed minimal considering his expertise and the resources of his shop, even if the engine proved to be exactly what it appeared, worthless scrap destined for the furnace. When Lot 47 was called, only 2 other bidders showed interest, both likely scrapyard operators doing the same mental arithmetic regarding metal prices and transportation costs. Walter waded through the initial bids, then raised his numbered paddle when the price reached $280. One competitor immediately dropped out, leaving only a representative from a regional recycling center who pushed the price to $320 before shaking his head and stepping back. The auctioneer's gavel fell, and Walter found himself the owner of 1,200 pounds of corroded mystery that would require a flatbed trailer and considerable effort to transport to his shop 30 miles away. The logistics of moving the engine proved more challenging than anticipated. The warehouse manager provided a forklift operator who managed to load the pallet onto Walter's borrowed trailer, but the process revealed just how extensive the deterioration had become. Sections of what appeared to be external plumbing or fuel lines crumbled away during the lifting process, falling to the concrete floor in rust-stained fragments. The engine shifted slightly on its wooden supports, producing groaning sounds that suggested internal components had seized solid over the decades of neglect. By the time Walter secured the load with heavy straps and tarps against the continuing rain, he found himself questioning whether his instincts had finally led him astray after all these years. The drive back to his shop through November darkness tested both his truck and his resolve as the trailer's suspension complained about the weight and every pothole threatened to shift the precariously balanced load. Walter's workshop occupied a converted dairy barn on the outskirts of a small town that had seen better economic times, its main street lined with more shuttered storefronts than active businesses. He had purchased the property 20 years earlier when rural real estate prices had bottomed out, drawn by the large clear-span interior space, three-phase electrical service, and enough land to avoid noise complaints from neighbors when he ran equipment late into the night. The building had served him well, housing his collection of tools, machinery, and partially completed projects that represented both his livelihood and his passion for mechanical resurrection. Unloading the engine required the use of his shop's overhead crane system, a process he conducted slowly and methodically despite the lateness of the hour and the accumulated fatigue of a long day. The pallet came apart as he lifted the engine free, the wooden planks having rotted where moisture had collected against the metal surfaces. Walter lowered his acquisition onto a reinforced stand designed for supporting heavy engine blocks during rebuilds, positioning it beneath his primary work lights to allow for proper examination. Only then, with the engine finally stationary under bright illumination, did he begin to fully appreciate both the challenge he had undertaken and the possibility that his instincts might have led him to something extraordinary. Morning light filtering through the workshop's high windows revealed details that darkness had obscured during the previous night's unloading operations. Walter approached the engine with fresh eyes and hot coffee, ready to begin the careful process of assessment that would determine whether he had made a shrewd investment or an expensive mistake. The rust appeared even more extensive in daylight, having penetrated so deeply in some areas that the original metal surfaces seemed more memory than substance. Decades of exposure to moisture, temperature fluctuations, and atmospheric contamination had worked their destructive chemistry on iron, steel, and aluminum alloys alike. He began with documentation, photographing the engine from multiple angles and taking detailed measurements of major components and overall dimensions. The radial configuration he had suspected proved accurate upon closer inspection. Cylinders arranged in a circular pattern around a central crankcase, the classic architecture of aircraft engines from the piston era. He counted cylinder attachment points, finding evidence of 14 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, a configuration that suggested significant power output and sophisticated engineering. The displacement would have been substantial, likely well over 2,000 cubic inches, placing this engine in the category of large fighters or medium bombers rather than trainers or light aircraft. Working methodically, Walter began removing the loose surface rust and accumulated debris using wire brushes, scrapers, and patience. Each section cleaned revealed more details about the engine's construction and history. Manufacturer's stampings began to emerge on various components, though many were fragmentary or rendered illegible by corrosion. He found what appeared to be inspection stamps, quality control marks, and alphanumeric codes that might have been production batch numbers or military specifications. The casting quality, even accounting for decades of deterioration, showed precision that confirmed this was no ordinary engine even for its era. The cooling fins that ringed each cylinder, though heavily corroded, displayed remarkable uniformity and density, suggesting engineering focused on managing the tremendous heat generated by high-performance operation. Walter calculated the fin spacing and estimated the total cooling surface area, arriving at numbers that indicated this engine had been designed to operate at power levels and sustained output far exceeding civilian aviation requirements. The metallurgy, as far as he could determine through visual inspection, involved aluminum alloys in the cylinder heads and steel in the crankcase and major structural components, combinations that represented advanced material science for what he increasingly suspected was a World War II-era design. Several days passed as Walter continued his careful excavation of information from beneath the corrosion, working in the hours between paying repair jobs that kept his business solvent. He discovered remnants of control linkages that would have connected to throttle, mixture, and propeller pitch systems. The supercharger assembly, once he identified it with certainty, was a sophisticated two-stage unit that would have allowed the engine to maintain power output at high altitudes where atmospheric pressure dropped significantly. This single feature narrowed the possible applications considerably. Only military aircraft operating at altitudes above 20,000 feet required such complex forced induction systems. The breakthrough came when Walter began examining the reduction gear housing that connected the engine's high-speed crankshaft to the propeller hub. After carefully removing layers of hardened grease and rust, he exposed a data plate that had been protected by its recessed mounting position. The aluminum placard bore stampings that had survived the decades largely intact, revealing information that made Walter's heart rate accelerate. The manufacturer's name appeared first, a company he recognized as a major aircraft engine producer during the Second World War. Below that, a model designation consisting of letters and numbers that seemed vaguely familiar but which he could not immediately place within his knowledge of aviation history. Walter spent the evening in his small office area, surrounded by reference books collected over decades and conducting internet searches on his aging computer. The model designation led him down multiple research paths, most of which dead-ended or contradicted each other. Aviation forums provided some hints, with knowledgeable enthusiasts discussing various engine types and their applications. Historical databases offered production numbers and specifications for common models. But the specific designation on his engine appeared in only the most obscure references, usually as footnotes or passing mentions in discussions of experimental programs and prototype development. It was well past midnight when he stumbled upon a digitized document from a military aviation museum's archive, a technical report dating from 1943 that discussed advanced engine development programs. The report mentioned his engine's designation in the context of a high-altitude fighter program that had been initiated in response to enemy aircraft operating at extreme altitudes where standard power plants struggled to perform. The program had been ambitious, aiming to create an engine capable of maintaining over 2,000 horsepower at altitudes exceeding 35,000 feet. Only a handful of prototypes had been built before the program was redirected toward other priorities and eventually cancelled as the war's requirements shifted. Walter read through the available documentation multiple times, cross-referencing dates, specifications, and historical contexts. The prototype engines had been extensively tested but never reached production. Their development terminated when the aircraft they were intended to power was also cancelled in favor of other designs. Official records indicated that the prototype engines had been returned to the manufacturer, presumably for teardown and analysis. After that, the trail went cold. No further mentions in production records, no transfers to museums or research institutions, no documentation of disposal or scrapping. The engines had simply vanished from the historical record sometime in the mid-1940s. The implications sent Walter's mind racing through possibilities. If this engine was indeed one of those lost prototypes, its historical significance would be enormous. Aviation museums would be intensely interested in acquiring such a rare artifact. Collectors of military aviation memorabilia would likely offer substantial sums. But beyond monetary value, the engine represented a tangible connection to a fascinating period of rapid technological advancement driven by wartime necessity. It was a physical embodiment of engineering ambition, a three-dimensional record of attempts to push beyond the performance boundaries that constrained aircraft designers and military planners during the most desperate years of global conflict. He spent the following days attempting to verify his theory through more detailed examination of the engine itself. Serial numbers, once he located them stamped into the crankcase, matched the format described in the limited documentation he had found. Component configurations aligned with technical drawings partially reproduced in historical texts. The presence of certain experimental features mentioned in test reports, unusual bearing configurations, modified valve timing mechanisms, experimental metallurgy in certain high-stress components, all corresponded to the prototype program he had identified. Each new piece of evidence strengthened his conclusion while simultaneously raising questions about how such a significant historical artifact had ended up in a warehouse auction, catalogued as anonymous scrap metal. Walter contacted several aviation historians and museum curators, initially approaching conversations cautiously to gauge their knowledge and interest without fully revealing what he believed he possessed. The reactions varied from polite interest to barely contained excitement, particularly from a curator at a major aerospace museum who specialized in World War II-era propulsion systems. When Walter finally shared detailed photographs and the information from the data plate, the curator's response arrived within hours rather than days, asking permission to visit the shop for a personal examination and authentication of the find. The authentication process took place over 2 days as the curator, accompanied by a colleague specializing in metallurgical analysis, conducted exhaustive documentation of every accessible component. They photographed stampings and markings, measured critical dimensions, took samples of various alloys for composition analysis, and cross-referenced their findings against archived documents from the engine manufacturer's historical records. The verdict, when it finally came, exceeded even Walter's most optimistic hopes. This was definitively one of the prototype engines from the high-altitude fighter program, specifically the third unit built in a series of only 5 complete prototypes. Moreover, it appeared to be the only survivor, the other 4 having been apparently destroyed or lost to history. The curator explained that such prototypes were typically scrapped after testing programs concluded, their materials recycled into new projects as war production demands consumed every available resource. That this unit had somehow avoided that fate represented an extraordinary stroke of preservation, even if the decades of neglect had taken a severe toll on its physical condition. The corrosion, while extensive, had not completely destroyed the engine's integrity or historical value. Many critical components, though no longer functional, retained enough of their original form that the engine could serve both as a museum display piece and as a reference for understanding the engineering solutions applied to specific technical challenges of that era. News of the discovery spread through the specialized communities of aviation historians, military technology enthusiasts, and museum professionals with remarkable speed despite Walter's initial efforts to maintain some discretion. Within weeks of the authentication, he began receiving inquiries from institutions around the world expressing interest in acquiring the engine for their collections. The offers ranged from modest proposals for long-term loans to substantial purchase prices that made Walter reconsider his modest retirement plans. But beyond the financial aspects, he found himself deeply invested in understanding the complete story of how this engine had traveled from a test cell in 1943 to a warehouse pallet in the present day. The trail of ownership proved challenging to reconstruct, involving property records, corporate archives, and interviews with elderly individuals who had peripheral connections to the engine's journey through time. Walter learned that after the program's cancellation, the prototype engines had indeed been shipped back to the manufacturer's facility for evaluation and disposition. Standard procedure would have been immediate scrapping, but post-war chaos and the massive reorganization of defense industries had created administrative gaps where objects could slip through documentation systems. This particular engine appeared to have been set aside, possibly for educational purposes or as a reference example, then moved to a storage facility when the company restructured its operations. Decades passed with the engine languishing in various storage locations as the company that had built it underwent mergers, acquisitions, and eventual dissolution. Corporate assets were sold, facilities were repurposed, and historical items were often treated as unwanted clutter rather than valuable artifacts. At some point in the 1970s, the engine had been acquired by an industrial surplus dealer who had accumulated warehouses full of obsolete machinery and manufacturing equipment. That dealer had eventually retired, his inventory passing to other hands through estate sales and liquidation auctions. The engine had migrated through this gray market of industrial remnants for perhaps 30 years before landing in the warehouse where Walter had found it, its identity completely obscured by corrosion and the loss of any accompanying documentation. This reconstruction of the engine's post-war wandering explained the mystery, but also highlighted the fragility of historical preservation. Had Walter not possessed the specific knowledge to recognize the engine's potential significance, it would certainly have been scrapped, its metal recycled into new products with no record of what had been lost. Thousands of similar artifacts had undoubtedly met that fate, unique objects destroyed simply because no one present at the critical moment understood what they were looking at or cared enough to investigate further. The random nature of preservation troubled Walter, suggesting that the historical record was far more incomplete than most people realized. The curator who had authenticated the engine proposed a collaboration that would serve multiple purposes. The museum would provide resources and expertise for a complete conservation effort aimed at stabilizing the engine's condition and preventing further deterioration. In exchange, Walter would donate the engine to the museum's permanent collection, ensuring its preservation and public accessibility while receiving a tax deduction based on the appraised value. Additionally, the museum would create an exhibit around the engine that told both the story of the high-altitude fighter program and the remarkable tale of the engine's rediscovery, positioning Walter's detective work as an integral part of the historical narrative. Walter agreed to the proposal after carefully considering his options and consulting with advisors about the financial and ethical implications. The decision felt right. This engine had survived against extraordinary odds and deserved to be accessible to people who could appreciate its significance and learn from its story. Moreover, the publicity around the discovery had already generated more business for his shop than he could handle, with customers seeking his expertise specifically because they had read about his ability to see value in objects others dismissed as worthless scrap. The intangible rewards of recognition and professional satisfaction far exceeded any amount he might have received from a private sale. The conservation process began that spring, with the engine carefully transported to the museum's restoration facility under conditions that protected it from further environmental damage. Specialized conservators worked methodically to stabilize the corrosion, remove harmful contaminants, and preserve as much of the original material as possible. They did not attempt to restore the engine to running condition or even to a cosmetically perfect state. The goal was authentic preservation that retained the marks of its history while preventing continued degradation. The rust, the damaged components, the missing pieces all told parts of the story that deserved to be visible rather than erased through over-aggressive restoration. Walter visited the facility periodically during the conservation work, fascinated by the techniques and technologies applied to his discovery. Conservators used electrochemical processes to stabilize rust, applied protective coatings that were reversible if future conservation science developed better methods, and documented every aspect of the engine's condition through photography, three-dimensional scanning, and detailed written descriptions. The level of care and expertise applied to preserving a corroded engine block moved Walter deeply, validating his instinct that this object deserved better than the scrap furnace. The exhibit opened 18 months after the initial discovery, occupying a prominent position in the museum's World War II aviation gallery. The engine sat on a custom-designed mount that allowed visitors to view it from all angles while protecting it from physical contact. Interpretive panels explained the high-altitude fighter program, the engineering challenges addressed by the prototype engines, and the circumstances of the engine's rediscovery and authentication. Photographs from Walter's initial documentation showed the engine as he had first seen it, covered in rust and anonymous in the warehouse. Additional displays featured artifacts from the engine's conservation, including rust samples, fragments that had fallen away during transport, and microscopic images of the metallurgical structures that had survived decades of corrosion. Walter attended the opening ceremony, uncomfortable with the attention but pleased to see people engaging seriously with the story his discovery had made possible. School groups studied the engine as part of lessons about World War II technology and engineering innovation. Military veterans recognized the significance of performance specifications that had seemed routine during their service but which represented remarkable achievements viewed from historical distance. Aviation enthusiasts debated details of the prototype program and speculated about how the high-altitude fighter might have performed if the program had continued. Young people considering careers in engineering or conservation learned that important discoveries could happen anywhere, requiring only the knowledge to recognize significance and the determination to investigate thoroughly. The discovery's impact extended beyond the museum exhibit and the satisfaction of solving a historical mystery. Aviation historians revisited assumptions about prototype disposition procedures, recognizing that other significant artifacts might still exist in unexpected locations if researchers knew where and how to look. Several similar discoveries followed in subsequent years as Walter's story inspired others to examine industrial surplus and estate sale items more carefully, occasionally identifying rare engines, components, or even complete aircraft that had slipped through the documentation gaps of post-war industrial reorganization. The community of people who cared about preserving aviation history expanded, drawing in individuals whose professional backgrounds gave them the expertise to recognize what others might miss. Walter found himself invited to speak at museums, historical societies, and aviation events, sharing his experience and encouraging others to trust their instincts when something seemed unusual or significant. He emphasized the importance of broad knowledge, careful observation, and persistent research, the skills that had allowed him to see past the rust and recognize the possibility of something extraordinary. His talks often attracted younger attendees interested in mechanical trades or engineering, drawn by a story that demonstrated how traditional skills and historical knowledge could intersect in unexpected and rewarding ways. Some of those young people later contacted him seeking apprenticeships or advice about careers that combined hands-on mechanical work with historical preservation, creating connections Walter found deeply gratifying. The financial aspects of the discovery, while not life-changing in the dramatic sense sometimes portrayed in media coverage, provided Walter with comfortable security in his later years. The tax deduction from donating the engine to the museum, combined with the increased business his shop received from the publicity, eliminated concerns about retirement funding and allowed him to be selective about the projects he accepted. He focused increasingly on historically significant restorations, applying his skills to objects that had stories worth preserving rather than simply rebuilding engines for purely functional purposes. The work satisfied him in ways that routine repair jobs never had, connecting his mechanical expertise to broader narratives about technological development and human achievement. The museum periodically invited Walter back for special programs related to the engine exhibit. He participated in panel discussions with historians, conducted workshops on recognizing significant artifacts, and mentored young conservators learning the specialized techniques required for preserving corroded metal objects. These activities kept him connected to a community of people who shared his appreciation for mechanical history and understood the importance of preserving physical evidence of past engineering efforts. The relationships he developed through these connections enriched his final working years and provided intellectual stimulation that complemented the satisfaction of hands-on mechanical work. Several researchers used Walter's discovery as a case study in discussions about cultural heritage preservation and the challenges of maintaining comprehensive historical records. Academic papers analyzed how and why significant artifacts disappeared from official documentation, exploring the administrative chaos of wartime production, post-war industrial reorganization, and the institutional biases that favored preserving certain types of objects while treating others as disposable. Walter's story illustrated both the fragility of material heritage and the crucial role individuals could play in identifying and rescuing artifacts that institutional systems had failed to protect. The scholarly attention felt somewhat abstract to Walter, but he appreciated that his practical actions had contributed to theoretical discussions about how societies preserved their technological histories. Media coverage of the discovery varied from straightforward news reporting to somewhat sensationalized accounts that inflated both the financial value and the dramatic elements of the story. Walter gave interviews selectively, preferring journalists who demonstrated genuine interest in the historical and technical aspects rather than those seeking only emotional human interest angles. He wanted people to understand that the significance lay not primarily in monetary value, but in what the engine revealed about a particular moment in aviation history and the engineering solutions that talented people had developed under extraordinary pressure. The commercial aspects, while not irrelevant, were secondary to the preservation of knowledge and the connection the engine provided to past human efforts and achievements. As years passed and Walter eventually retired from active shop work, the engine he had rescued continued serving as an educational resource and a tangible connection to aviation history. New generations of museum visitors encountered it, each bringing their own perspectives and drawing their own meanings from the story of its creation, abandonment, and rediscovery. School children touched the interactive displays surrounding the exhibit, manipulating models that demonstrated radial engine operation and supercharger function. Engineering students studied the technical solutions visible in the prototype's construction, recognizing approaches that later influenced production engine designs. Military history enthusiasts placed the engine in the context of strategic bombing campaigns, high-altitude reconnaissance missions, and the broader technological competition that had characterized the Second World War. The exhibit text was periodically updated as new research emerged, incorporating discoveries made possible by Walter's find. Historians located additional documentation about the prototype program, including test reports and engineering correspondence that had been misfiled or overlooked in earlier research. Metallurgical analysis of samples taken during conservation revealed details about experimental alloys and manufacturing processes that expanded understanding of wartime materials science. Other museums with related artifacts collaborated on comparative studies, using Walter's engine as a reference point for authenticating and interpreting similar objects in their own collections. The engine's value as a research resource continued growing even as its physical condition remained static, preserved but not restored. Walter maintained his connection to the museum and the broader community of aviation historians until his health no longer permitted active participation. Friends from that community visited him regularly, bringing updates about new discoveries, ongoing research, and the continuing impact of his contribution to the field. They shared stories about visitors who had been moved or inspired by the engine exhibit, career decisions influenced by the story of its discovery, and subsequent finds that had been made by people who cited Walter's example as motivation to investigate rather than discard unusual objects. These conversations provided satisfaction that transcended the original moment of discovery, confirming that his actions had created ripples extending far beyond the immediate circumstances of a warehouse auction on a rainy November afternoon. The engine itself remained in the museum collection, its preservation ensured by institutional commitments and professional standards that would outlast any individual's lifetime. Conservation specialists monitored its condition regularly, applying new protective treatments as conservation science advanced and environmental controls improved. The exhibit space was periodically redesigned to incorporate new interpretive approaches and technologies, but the engine remained the central artifact, its corroded surfaces and missing components testifying to both its historical authenticity and the remarkable circumstances of its survival. Visitors continued encountering it, each person bringing their own knowledge, interests, and circumstances to the experience of viewing an object that represented countless hours of engineering effort, decades of neglect, and one person's instinct that something valuable might lie beneath the rust. This incredible journey from a scrapyard find to a priceless piece of history shows us that treasures are still out there, waiting for someone with the knowledge and passion to recognize them. If this story of discovery and dedication moved you, hit that subscribe button now and show your support with a super thanks. You'll be helping us bring more amazing forgotten histories back to life. And before you go, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Are there forgotten treasures hiding in your area? We'd love to hear your stories and connect with fellow history enthusiasts across the globe. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your curiosity sharp. You never know what extraordinary piece of history might be waiting in the most unexpected places.